Live from Nigeria, a closer look at the most tightly contested vote since the end of military rule in 1999. Eritrea's poor human rights situation is blamed for the huge exodus of migrants from the Horn of Africa nation to the European Union. And Starbucks brews up a controversy about race and faces a swift online backlash. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Vincent McCory, and this is Africa 54. Now to the Middle East. Yemen has tumbled into violence and chaos since a popular uprising ousted its longtime President Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2012. The nation's ongoing strife has drawn increased focus from other countries in the region and its allies overseas. The search for a political solution continues as rival factions in the north and south press their fight for control. Now, the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, Matthew Tuller, told Reuters on Monday that he is relatively optimistic that a new power-sharing agreement can be reached between the internationally recognized government of President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi and the Houthi rebels who control the capital, Sana'a. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal told reporters in Riyadh that Arab countries would take necessary measures against the Houthis if a peaceful solution to the crisis cannot be found. Well, on Monday, the White House said the United States has capability to handle security issues regarding Yemen, despite the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces there. Speaking to Al Hurra TV, Department of Defense spokesperson Colonel Steve Warren acknowledged there will be some challenges, however, moving forward.
There's no question the situation in Yemen is extraordinarily complex. There's no question the situation in Yemen has become dangerous. The security situation has deteriorated. As far as American military intervention, this is not something that we will discuss publicly at this point. Our focus now is to continue hunting, finding, and killing members of al-Qaeda. Well, there's no question that the withdrawal of American personnel from Yemen will impact our ability to fight al-Qaeda. There's simply no question about that. Nevertheless, we have very sophisticated intelligence collection capabilities. We have very sophisticated strike capabilities, and we will bring those to bear. That said, it is clear that the deteriorating and complex security situation does make our job more difficult.
Well, that was Department of Defense spokesperson Colonel Steve Warren speaking to Al Hurra television. Well, the European Union's border operations is preparing for a record number of migrants in 2012. Most of them try to cross the Mediterranean Sea from Africa into Europe. As summer approaches and calmer waters appear, more migrants are likely to try to make the dangerous trip. Hundreds of migrants from across Africa are currently waiting in a holding facility in Libya without aid and health care. They say they will not give up their long and dangerous trek until they reach Europe. Well, among the hundreds of immigrants at the center are 260 males from Senegal, 38 from Eritrea, 17 from Somalia, 43 from Gambia, 28 from Niger, 34 from Sudan, and a few from several other African nations. There are 64 women at the facility, and most of them are from Eritrea and Somalia. Well, Eritrea is the second largest source of migrants after Syria, making the perilous trips across the Mediterranean to Europe. The chairman of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea, Mike Smith, told the UN Human Rights Council that the country's poor human rights situation is to be blamed for the huge exodus of migrants from the Horn of Africa nation. With me in the studio today is Mr. Mike Smith. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
Now, first, we know that when you released this report, the immediate reaction of the Ethiopian authorities was that, well, this is a cooked-up report because they believe that you did not gather the information from credible sources. What do you say?
Well, my first answer to that is we haven't done the report yet. This was an interim report on where we're going. It's a kind of an update on where we're at. My second comment is that, of course, we would most like to be able to gather information inside Eritrea itself. But from the very start, the creation of this commission, the Eritrean government has refused to allow us to visit. Now, they may still decide, and we hope they will change their mind, but for the moment, we can't go to Eritrea to interview people or to inspect the situation, and therefore we have to carry out our investigations from outside. And we believe the most credible way to do that is to talk to as many people as we can about their personal experiences, what happened to them. And we've interviewed more than 400 people, and in that respect we are getting a picture that is emerging of problems in the human rights area in a number of different fields.
Yes, and even before you present the final report, you did actually present an interim report to the UN Human Rights Council. Question is, what kind of stories are these people telling you? Is it the same story that can be replicated across these hundreds of people?
No, it's very interesting because every story is different. Every person's life is different. Every person's experiences are different. Every person's personality is different. So the way in which the system that operates in Eritrea impacts on people is always going to be different. But by talking to as many people as that, and by collecting all of those stories, when you put them one on top of each other, there are certain common features that emerge, and those are the areas that we've identified as being a particular problem.
Now, what are the specific forms of violations that you kind of heard from all these people?
The biggest one, and the one, in a sense, which is creates many of the others, is the fact that there is universal national service in Eritrea, which is not unusual. Many countries have national service. But in this case, it is unlimited in time. So a young person in year 11 or year 12, say 16 or 17 years old, is obliged to go to do their basic military training. They go there, and then after that, they very often have no further choices in their lives because they get sent into a military unit. In the military unit, they get sent out to work on projects, sometimes in agriculture, sometimes in infrastructure, sometimes in building, and they are subject to full military discipline, and they can stay there for 10 years, 20 years sometimes. At the same time, they're paid very little. They're paid something like 450 nakfa a month, which current, at least the unofficial rate, is something like $10 a month. That is clearly not enough for a person to have a normal life, to be able to support a family.
So they'd rather go away and try to make a living elsewhere. But there are other groups also
that's
that
the
are
group
being
we're
oppressed.
talking about.
Oh, that's majorly the group
that's
that
the
is
major
being
thing.
affected.
But there are other obviously other problems that happen. The discipline, particularly in the military, is very harsh, and people for minor infractions of the rules can be treated extremely harshly, which verges onto torture. On top of that, there is an imposition by the government of complete control on information, on people's capacity to be able to have a discussion, to debate government policy. Any form of criticism that emerges even in a public meeting or between two people can result in someone being punished.
Well, Mr. Smith, thank you very much for giving us those insights.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Mike Smith is the chairman of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea. We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we covered. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. And check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Coming up, on the front lines, the risks of healthcare workers treating tuberculosis patients. Stay with us.
Nigeria decides 2015. The final hours of the presidential campaign for Nigeria. What happens there matters throughout Africa. VOA News is ready with the largest team of international journalists in Nigeria and surrounding countries. Special coverage of Nigeria presidential election voting begins this Saturday. our commitment to Africa from Voice of America.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines. In Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara is chosen by his party to run for re-election in October. In Chad, Nigerian refugees take in children separated from their parents after Boko Haram attacks. In eastern DRC, the town of Mutarule remains a ghost town after the 2014 ethnic violence resulted in dozens of deaths. Finally, in Botswana, experts warn that Africa faces a poaching crisis that is likely to see a further decline in the number of elephants. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Well, it's time now for Health Report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu. Hello, Lino.
Hello, Vincent. Tuberculosis is a worldwide epidemic that each year kills 1.5 million people. Healthcare workers are on the front lines of this epidemic. According to the research TB Unmasked by ERIS, up to 80% of TB cases among healthcare workers can be connected to their work. For more on the subject, I'm joined by Dr. Louis Schreger, Vice President for Scientific Affairs with ERIS, global nonprofit biotech based outside Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Schreger.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Also joining us live via Skype from South Africa is Dr. Uvistra Naido, a practicing physician in Durban and a survivor of multi-drug resistant TB. Dr. Naido, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let me start with you, Dr. Schreger, and I would like to start with some numbers. Healthcare workers are 2 times more at risk of being infected with TB in the United States, 5 times in South Africa, and 5 to 11 times in India. It is a serious problem.
It's a major problem for healthcare workers. It's a real issue because the healthcare workers obviously are on the front lines. They are necessary to be treating these patients, and they're putting themselves at risk.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Naido, let me come to you. You were infected a few years ago. You went through 3 years of treatment, a little over 3 years, and about 20 pills a day. What was this experience like? Can you share your story?
Well, I think we work in a system where you're primed to be an academic at the end of the day and look at patients and sick patients. But when you're at the receiving end as being a patient, I think you get to see the shortfalls of the system, particularly where we're in a very scientific, competitive academic world. Whereas I think we lack a lot of empathy, and it was a real humbling, eye-opening experience for me. My treatment lasted 3 years, 1 week, and a day. And it was wrought with many complications, which was what kept me in tuberculosis work thereafter.
Well, we're glad to know that you recovered from this. And Dr. Schreger, Dr. Naido mentioned the shortfall of the system. Shouldn't healthcare workers be vaccinated against TB? There is a TB treatment, the BCG vaccine. Are they being vaccinated? Is it mandatory, or shouldn't there be?
So a couple of things that is important to understand. BCG, while it is a vaccination for tuberculosis, is only indicated to prevent serious tuberculosis in infants and young children. Okay. It does not prevent infection or disease, to the best of our knowledge, in persons once they get past 9 years of age. That's why we have such a big problem with TB globally. If there were to be a vaccine, it wouldn't have to be mandatory. Healthcare workers would be demanding it.
Now, Dr. Naido, after going through this experience, what is your sentiment in terms of the way this should be addressed with regards to healthcare workers? There is no vaccine for, at least with regards to addressing adults, a good vaccine out there, and perhaps that's where ERIS come in. What is your sentiment on this issue?
Well, I think it's a vital area in research and continued work in tuberculosis. If we don't have our frontline workers in any setting where we are tuberculosis afflicted, how can we curb the fight against it at the end of the day? A vaccine ultimately would ensure protection of healthcare workers, but also just help bolster their motivation to keep working. At the moment, no matter where you work in the world, a healthcare worker would always put himself out in the front line against a patient that is terribly ill. I think this would be an extra piece of armor that would really help the fight at the end of the day.
And we've seen the risk of healthcare workers with regards to the Ebola crisis. We've seen that as well. Now, we talked about vaccine. ARES has been working on developing a vaccine against TB. Where do we stand, Dr. Schrager, and what are the roadblocks? Because it's been a few years now.
Right. So we stand by we've made enormous progress so far. If you look 10 years ago, there was only one vaccine candidate in clinical trials. Now we have 13 candidates in clinical trials. That's amazing progress in just 10 years. But one major roadblock is that we're still trying to figure out what kind of immune response is necessary to actually prevent or protect against tuberculosis disease and infection. We're working very hard to figure that out. Another important roadblock is that we don't have what's called a human challenge model where we could safely vaccinate volunteers and then challenge them with a very benign type of tuberculosis to see if the vaccine worked. We have that kind of model in malaria and many other infections, and we're working very hard to develop that in tuberculosis, but we're still a number of years away from that.
Dr. Naidoo, you are a practicing physician. You come in contact with patients, perhaps TB patients. How do you protect yourself? What are you doing differently this time around that you didn't do before?
As a pediatrician, I look after sick kids, and kids don't have a very high burden of TB, but their parents that look after them do. So I'm always in the firing line against these bugs. Ever since my TB ordeal, I wear my N95 mask religiously. Okay. But to be honest, it isn't something that's very practical. You can't talk to a patient. You can't get that human experience of trust at the end of the day with this mask on. And in South Africa, where I'm practicing, the majority of doctors actually still to this day do not wear their protective masks, just out of that human connection with the patient. And I think that's something we should be addressing. But at the moment, I do still live in fear of that bug coming every single day. But it's still a fear that I have to overcome. But you got to stay and do what you love at the end of the day.
And now ARES, Dr. Schrager, produced a series of 5 short films in the TB Unmasked series showing the risk of healthcare workers. Now, the last film featured actually the head of the United States CDC, Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Tom Frieden, who tested positive earlier in his career and had been treated as a precaution since. What was surprising or perhaps enlightening during this work in putting this film together and investigating for this project?
Well, one of the enlightening and really uplifting aspects of doing it is learning the stories. I mean, learning Uvi's story and learning the stories of others that are putting themselves at risk on the front lines and are still willing to take care of patients, are dedicated to taking care of patients, and are supporting our efforts to develop vaccines, because as we've discussed, I mean, that ultimately would be the key armor that would be protecting healthcare workers.
How long do you think it will take to have a vaccine?
Very difficult question. Obviously, we're trying our best to have it happen as soon as possible. This is a very challenging organism, but we're making real progress. I'd love to tell you 10 years. We're hoping something like that, but you have to test. That's why we do these trials, and we'll hope for the best.
Absolutely. And Dr. Naidoo, if you're still with us, I wanted to ask you, what do you hope to see moving forward?
Just a more positive world. I think having companies like ARES putting forward vaccine trials, it makes us hopeful. I look at TB has been around for the last 70,000 years. And I always say that it's that humility that we need as human beings. We think we are dominating this world, but I think how mistaken we are. But I think it's a way for us to come together and work more positively forward. Vaccines at the day offer a lot of hope, so I'm very hopeful.
And Dr. Naidu is very hopeful. What about you? Vaccine is the way to protect healthcare workers. What is the way forward then?
So, number one, I am also very hopeful. And the way forward is to continue doing research. We need to have a lot more preclinical research. We could use a lot more funds for this. There are a lot of type of experiments and work that we could do. We really do need more funding, more support. These trials are expensive. They're difficult to do. But we're committed to doing them and to moving a vaccine candidate into the clinic and hopefully get it licensed as soon as possible.
Now, Dr. Naidu, can you give us a sense of the type of TB? We hear about MDR TB, XDR TB, TB in general. Can you just briefly explain to us the difference?
Well, basically, TB is a bacillus. It's a bacterium which we have traditionally used for antibiotics to treat them in the past. Since we've had our advent of antibiotics since the peri-1930s, we haven't changed that regimen since. So basically, we've been using 4 drugs: rifampicin, INH, pyrazinamide, ethambutol. As time has gone on, the bug has developed immunity, and we've developed multi-drug resistant TB, which is a resistance to our antibiotics with rifampicin and INH. XDR TB, or extensively drug-resistant TB, is the same definition as multi-drug resistant TB, but it adds on resistance to some multi-drug resistant TB antibiotics, such as fluoroquinolones and injectables that we use for patients. So basically, the bug is evolving to be much stronger. And as you go from ordinary drug-sensitive TB to drug-resistant TB, the duration of treatment is actually prolonged. And that is our difficulty at the moment, to actually get patients adherent to this. And in the face of HIV with the TB pandemic, it's proving very trying as a clinician these days.
And the HIV/AIDS pandemic has really made treating TB a great challenge. So when you work on developing this vaccine, to what extent HIV/AIDS is a factor in this?
Oh, it's a huge factor. I mean, the vaccines that we develop need to be able to be used safely in HIV infected individuals. But I also want to get back to a point that Dr. Naidu raised, and that is that with multiple multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, with extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, it's important to understand that drug resistance does not mean vaccine resistance. So that the vaccine should be able, once we get one that actually protects, to protect against all types of TB, whether it be drug resistant or not. Terribly important point to understand.
Okay. Now, as a pediatrician, Dr. Naidu, do you still administer the BCG vaccine? At what point do you do that, if you do, for children?
In South Africa, it's typically given at birth, provided a child looks immunocompetent. But it's generally a bug that protects you in your infancy. But as Doctor previously had mentioned, that it protects you against the severe types of TB. But as you get older, that immunity is actually wanes over time. So it actually confers no immunity as you become an adolescent to an adult. So although it is still used, it does offer protection from severe forms of TB when you are very young. But currently, we're facing a much bigger problem than just the young people in the world at the moment with TB infection and disease. So hence the BCG is not very helpful.
Okay, Dr. Naidu, thank you so much for joining us from Durban. Dr. Schreger, it was a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that was Dr. Lewis Schreger, Vice President for Scientific Affairs with ARIS, and MDR TB survivor, Dr. Yuvestra Naidu. That's our Africa Health Report for today. Back to you, Vincent.
Well, thanks a lot. And Now we want to take you all the way to West Africa, where Nigerians are heading to the polls on Saturday to vote in the country's presidential election. Now the race is tight between incumbent Goodluck Jonathan and the leading challenger, former military ruler Muhammadu Buhari. Economic wars and security fears are among the main issues talked about as the final days of the campaign draw to a close. The Boko Haram insurgency is battering Nigeria with almost daily attacks, and over the past 5 years has killed thousands and displaced 1.5 million people. Simultaneously, Nigeria is suffering from a plummeting currency, steep budget cuts, corruption scandals, and diving oil prices. Well, now, for the many journalists covering Nigeria's campaign rallies, can be a risky undertaking. At least one policeman was killed and scores of people were injured recently when 3 explosions and sporadic gunfire abruptly ended an event of the All Progressives Congress in Okrika, Rivers State. Among the injured was Channels TV senior political correspondent Charles Eruka, who was attacked while covering the rally. And now Charles joins us via phone from Channels TV, Lagos. Hello, Charles.
Hello, thanks so much for having me on.
Yes, now we're happy to see you, to hear that you're recovering, but give us a sense of what really happened that led to the situation that we just described.
Well, we were covering the event live. That's the All Progressives Congress rally in Okrika. Well, it all started with a minor explosion, something that sounded like a firecracker, just before the arrival of the APC APC governorship candidate, Dr. Dakuku Peterside. When we heard the explosion, the security officials ran around trying to figure out exactly what had happened. Something like a very tiny explosive device had been thrown into the arena, apparently. They identified where it had exploded. At that point, the crowd became a bit jittery, but then they assured everyone that, it was just someone playing a prank. So things turned to normal. The crowd was still assembling. Then shortly after, a louder explosion, a slightly louder one was held. That was about 5 minutes later. And people actually started getting restless. Then about 5 minutes after, a louder explosion, this one a pretty big bang, was heard again, somewhere behind the vicinity of the rally. And people now started leaving their seats and scampering out of the venue. But the organizers of the rally, they took to the microphone and urged the people to return because as far as they were concerned, people are just trying to let off explosions around the arena to frighten people away, to frustrate the
Charles.
rally. Yeah, I'm listening.
Yes. I just want to ask, how did you end up being roughed up, actually, so seriously?
Well, remember, gunfire was heard shortly after the explosions, and then everybody ran for dear life. And, we also tried to pack our equipment and get out of there. This was after I had given a live report of what was happening there.
Thanks a lot. Charles,
pretty much,
that's
but
it.
then when we got into Africa,
we'll continue with this conversation, Charles, another time. Well, that's our show. We ran out of time. And thanks a lot for watching. Have a good night. We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. In a lively half hour, news, sports, health, lifestyle information, comments from our viewers. Africa 54, the best for Africa, about Africa. Join us only on VOA.